Good afternoon, Nick. Whereabouts are you?
Hello. Well, I'm down in London at the moment. It's a very hot, muggy day down here, and I'm off back up to Newcastle this evening. So I'm very much looking forward to the blast of cold air that hits you when you step off the train at the station.
Are you looking forward to the ever smooth train services from London?
Well, of course, now it's a nationalised service on LNAR on the east coast. It runs to perfection most of the time.
Nationalised by Jeremy Corbyn, of course.
Along with many things that he might not have nationalised, but win the argument for nationalising them.
Wow, that's all you need to win an election. Win the
Oh, well,
argument.
indeed. Actually, in all seriousness, about 60% of the public, last time there was a poll on this, said that they supported nationalisation of the railway. And it's really quite an odd thing to have the track, the ticketing companies, the train operating companies, and the rolling stock companies all as different entities without being joined up. One of the things that I know we're moving towards is the Great British Railway concept. It's not exactly British Rail, but more like the sort of London franchise model for transport, where there'd be an overall contract and then everybody were expected to require the same livery, the same timetables, and so on. And one of the other things I think is a real challenge around railways, and I've plunged straight into railways before we've talked about the events of the last week, but it's one of those public services that just doesn't really change according to changing needs and circumstances. So most of the rail journeys that we have now are the rail journeys that we had pre-COVID, for example. And we're used to standard 5-day-a-week service with different services at weekends. And I think there was a question around whether we need some fundamental reform of the system in order to make sure it is modernised and continues to be fit for purpose for the future, given so much change going on in society.
One of the things I think is really interesting is the way that the people's views of the railways don't cross those normal, traditional Conservative Labour, party lines. I was in Newcastle yesterday, and I was chatting to my taxi driver, and he was, huge Leave voter, always voted Conservative his entire life, and yet said, no, I'm very much in favour of nationalising the railways. I think it's a very interesting, and it's an interesting one in terms of people's political views that it crosses that what is normally quite a big party dividing line.
A Conservative Brexit voting taxi driver in Newcastle, that's quite a rarity, surely.
Well, since the days of Boris Johnson, maybe less so.
Anyway,
Should
so
we?
since we last spoke, one of the things that has occurred in politics, which everybody was sort of looking to as an indication about what's the direction of travel, what's the next election looking like, and that was the three by-elections that were held last Thursday. And I think if anybody's looking for certainty and clarity and a sense of absolute, definitively, this is what's going to happen, they're probably a bit disappointed now, aren't they?
Certainly, I think things are all up in the air, especially after you would think, looking at the news on Friday morning, that Rishi Sunak had swept the board and won all three.
Well, it's
It,
remarkable, isn't it? How these were three by-elections, two of which the Conservative lost catastrophically, and yet the media coverage was all about Labour's failure to win Oxbridge and South Ruislip, which I think probably was genuinely down to some local issues on the doorstep. And we can maybe talk about some of those because I think quite relevant in terms of a policy agenda around net zero. But do you think people will be going into the summer recess happy ahead of party conference season? Was there something in each of the by-election results to please all of the parties, or do you think the Prime Minister is still really in a difficult place?
I think there was certainly something in each of the by-elections for all of the parties. The Conservatives are obviously absolutely overjoyed, holding on to Uxbridge, and by 450 votes, it's not very much, but they were certainly overjoyed by it. I think actually, though, if you look, and I wrote about this in my Sunday take article on the website last week. I think for me the most significant result, and the one that should worry the Conservative Party the most, is that result in Selby. I mean, this is rock solid North Yorkshire countryside commuter, wealthy commuters to both Leeds and York. I mean, I've got family in Tadcaster, which is part of the constituency, and it is proper true blue territory. And some people have made the mistake of saying, well, Labour held Selby by, from 1997 until 2010. It was a very different seat. It was a much more Labour seat, and actually that new seat is being recreated in the boundary changes. The Selby and Ainsty seat that Kier Starmer and the other Kier Mather won last week is much more traditional Brexit voting, rock solid Conservative North Yorkshire territory, Rishi Sunak's backyard. And Labour didn't just win it, but they won it by 4,000 on one of the biggest swings we've ever seen. Now, of course, as I said, it's necessarily an indication they can hold that seat in the general election. We saw, the Mid Staffordshire by-election in 1990 was, did Labour absolutely nothing to win it in the 92 election, and didn't win it in 1997. So you've got to always take these by-elections with a pinch of salt. But I think for me that was the most significant of the three results. I think the others were very much expected, particularly at Somerton was very much expected the Lib Dems would do well there. They'd been working it for a while. There was specific local circumstances. But in terms of Selby, for me, that was the one that should concern the Conservative Party the most.
I think that's probably the general view within Labour too. And you can't deny it was an absolutely stunning by-election result. And hats off to Kier Mather, the new MP there, ran an absolutely brilliant campaign. And I was chatting to a friend of mine who's a Labour Party member in Selby, and she was saying, he's such an amazing campaigner. He's wise beyond his years, and she's normally a bit cynical about young people putting themselves forward in politics, but she was absolutely full of praise for him, genuinely full of praise for him. And I think that's a really good thing for politics, that somebody with youth and enthusiasm is coming in and will want to have an impact and make a difference. And of course, on the boundary changes, the seat nominally becomes more winnable for Labour. And I think in a way, what happened in Oxbridge, I think there's a danger of people over-interpreting this in terms of what it means for the future. And I think you're right. I think Selby is probably the most significant of all of those in terms of by-election results. I mean, my personal take on it was that I thought people were, on the whole, voting against the party that they liked even less than the one they voted for. A sort of plague on all your houses, but a particular plague on yours, so I'm going to vote for the other lot kind of thing. And also a bit of a kind of vote against the establishment, whatever people perceived the establishment to be at the time. And I think that's really problematic for the current government in the general election, because they cannot escape the fact that they are the establishment figures. The government of the day will be held to account for delivery or not delivery of promises. And I think it feels to me as though people have made up their minds that they want to change.
Do you think Labour has an expectation management problem?
Well, it's one of many problems Labour has. I think, we saw this a bit in the 2015 general election. A lot of Labour figures were very confident that Labour had won the 2015 general election because they were looking at Twitter. And Twitter was overwhelmingly supportive, lots and lots of, but of course what you don't realise is it's just an echo chamber and a bubble of people who are like you, and so you just don't see the other side, the other people's support. And it was a bit like that actually in the Brexit referendum, because I remember being at the count in Newcastle that night and thinking, well, I thought we'd done really well with the Remain campaign. Where the heck have all of these Leave votes come from? Because there were far more than you would have predicted based on the conversations we've had on the doorstep. So I think you've got to be really careful about over predicting on the basis of particular results. I also think, before we move off the by-election, I think the Uxbridge one was quite interesting because it was genuinely about a local issue, and whether that local issue was represented fairly or not by the parties, it was clearly a significant motivating factor on the doorstep. And I think that tells us a couple of things. Firstly, Labour needs to learn from that, because that was an entirely predictable political attack on Labour that just wasn't predicted in the by-election and could have been, and the outcome could have been different. So in a way, good for Labour to have learned that lesson now rather than have to learn it the very hard way in the general election. But the other thing that I think is perhaps a bit more worrying is that it shows that negative campaigning, divisive campaigning, dog whistle campaigning and culture war type campaigning, it can be electorally successful. And I think that's a worry in terms of the tone of the next election, which I think will be really vicious and nasty and not very pleasant at all.
I think on Uxbridge, ULEZ is one of those really interesting issues because it actually only affects about 10% of cars or people with cars within that constituency. Yet most people, when they were polled about this, there was some interesting polling from YouGov on this, actually said that they were very concerned about having to pay £12.50 to drive their car. There wasn't that understanding that it was only applying to certain cars, and it was one of those policies that people thought would affect them when actually for the vast majority of people just wouldn't.
And it's one of those policies that you have to question whether it's sensible to put something like that in place, given that it's inevitably going to be a temporary measure, even if it's in place for a decade, because at some point we'll have cars which are pretty much emission-free, and there'll be no need for the ULEZ. Same with clean air zones, and this was exactly the battle that I had in Newcastle over the Category C clean air zone, which doesn't include private vehicles, thankfully, because that would have been an absolute nightmare. There were a number of roads in Newcastle which triggered the requirement for an intervention. Client Earth took the government to court saying that you need a plan to do this. The government basically wrote to us and said the only solution here that you can use is a clean air zone, even though we pointed out that there were lots of other different solutions that were less costly, less disruptive, less politically difficult. But no, it was a kind of real sledgehammer to crack a nut kind of issue. And I suspect the same is of the ULEZ. And the other thing is, and you must have known this from your time in political offices, anything to do with traffic and transport generates the most extraordinary amount of correspondence and negativity, and it's usually the fear of change rather than the change itself that causes the real issues, because the opposition often melts away once a scheme's been introduced. But my goodness, nothing gets people's gander up quite as much as proposing some minor changes to the roads around about where they live.
Yeah, it's very true, and it's something which I have family in Newcastle where there's not that understanding of exactly how a scheme is going to work. They're complicated. You hear about how they work in other cities, but not necessarily how the fact that they're different between different cities. There can be that fear that it's going to apply to everyone. And actually, the people who for a lot of people that is a huge amount of money, £12.50 to be spending every single day if they need to use their car. And I think there's a very big difference between a clean air zone that applies to the city centre. So in Newcastle, it applies very much. It's a very contained city centre area, isn't it? Compared to one that actually goes right out to the suburbs. And I guess that is the fear that what people are concerned about.
I don't want to minimise the issue, because the issue in Newcastle, the clean air zone was triggered because there were a number of roads, including the central motorway, the stretch of it that runs just north of the Tyne Bridge, so the bit that's usually congested in rush hour. That was the bit of road that was the major trigger for the clean air zone. Well, of course, it's only a problem twice a day in rush hour. There are different ways of dealing with the rush hour, and actually it's better to have traffic on those major roads rather than taking detours through residential areas and bringing pollution into residential streets. But there is, I don't know whether you find this about the difference between Newcastle and London, but I notice when I'm down here in London, I often get choked up with the air quality, which just doesn't happen back in Newcastle. And quite often I end the day with a sort of tickly throat and a slightly tickly nose, and I'm almost convinced that's down to extra pollution in the environment.
I noticed it in particular when I first moved down. Actually, if you're ever wearing a shirt, you can often see it on like the cuffs of your shirt. It'll show up. I actually saw a really interesting and thoughtful interview about this with with Emily Thornberry, who was talking obviously about the result and some of the disappointment of the result. And she was saying how she's just been diagnosed with asthma, and undoubtedly down to the fact that she's lived in London and been diagnosed, quite a bit later in life. And actually, that is a London problem, and it's probably going to be a problem for still a very long time to come. And it's what I think has been very interesting to sort of move on from those by-elections is there has been a real push to sort of end the green agenda that we've seen over the last week since those by-elections. There's been talk of Number 10 dropping some of those green policies. Do you think that's a route that Labour are going to go down now?
No, and I think it would be a mistake to interpret the Oxbridge by-election result as a vote against green policies generally. I was saying earlier, people always object to traffic and transport changes, and I think you can't really extrapolate from the particular issue about the ultra-low emission zone in London to saying that means there's general opposition to all net zero policies, because I just don't think that's true. And I think it's a bit of a danger that the Conservative Party kind of overreacts to this. And of course there are some who are waiting in the wings who've been actively looking for a cause to champion a reduction in support for net zero and green initiatives in the Conservative Party. I think we saw a bit of a wobble with Kier and Sadiq over the last weekend, but I don't think that means that Labour is in any way going to water down its approach to net zero, its commitment to using that as a way of rebalancing the economy, or indeed wanting to claim the moral high ground for improving health, because the flip side of not having an ultra low emission zone is, so how many children are you prepared to see die then?
Really interesting polling out about this actually, and there's a perception, I think, particularly in those the red wall voters, for example, don't care about green issues. Actually, there was some polling out yesterday from More in Common, done by YouGov, which said that actually that's the opposite of that is the case. Red wall voters care more about the impact on temperatures, families, jobs, the impact on the country than actually voters at large. So I think there's a lot of confusion about what people actually care about when it comes to this. And swing voters, again, also in this poll, swing voters do not think that the government is doing enough on green policies. So
yeah.
I think it's going to be an interesting debate, but it's certainly not the vote winner that some people think it might be or hope it might be.
Well, I saw a bit of research not so long ago that said that councillors up for election who have campaigned for low traffic neighbourhoods or similar type schemes in their local areas aren't disadvantaged to the ballot box. And in fact, in some, I think it was Labour, it actually has a slight advantage to them electorally. And I think the specific issue about traffic issues is because cars aren't just another mode of transport alongside other types of transport. Culturally and symbolically, they represent freedom, choice, the ability to do what you want at a particular time. And so I think part of the reason why there's always such backlash on traffic issues is because subconsciously people feel it's that threat of choice and threat of freedom at stake, rather than simply switching from one type of transport to another. And we have to understand that culturally if we want to make some serious changes to our transport infrastructure. But I agree with you. I think particularly if policies around net zero, because frankly most people don't really know what net zero is and what it means, and there's a danger that it becomes that sort of exclusive language in politics that people use as a way of talking to each other in shorthand but cutting a lot of people out as a result. But I think it was presented as reducing household energy bills, better insulation, better energy consumption, ability potentially to offset some of your energy bills by generating your own through a micro system at home. All of those kind of things, I think, are the kind of things that people will just say, well, that's a no-brainer, of course we'll go for that.
One of the things that I think actually Ed Miliband has done a really, really good job on as Shadow, and Kier as well, as Shadow Climate Change and Net Zero Secretary, is to tie very closely together. We could see this at conference last year. The idea of net zero and cheaper bills. And that is something that no politician has ever been able to do successfully. It has always been seen as you can push for net zero, but that means higher bills, weaker energy security. Actually, he's tied those two things together, and that is an achievement. And that's beyond political lines. Anyone who cares about the environment, whether it's on the Conservative side, you've got people like Zach Goldsmith, or on the Labour side, where you've got people who are genuinely passionate about it, like Ed, for example. Tying those two things together has been very interesting.
The two big opposing forces in politics are fear and hope. And virtually every election campaign, you can see the division line between the party that's campaigning for fear because it's running a negative campaign about issues, or the party of hope. And the pendulum swings. Sometimes people are feeling anxious and therefore fear wins. Sometimes people are feeling more optimistic and hope wins. And for such a long time, the climate change and net zero agenda has really been the preserve of people who've campaigned to stop things happening. Don't take as many foreign holidays, don't fly as much, don't use central heating as much, don't follow this particular type of diet, etc., etc., etc. And I think it's felt negative and a bit preachy to a lot of people, which is why I think the genius of what Kier and Ed have done is reframe it as this can help your lives get better. This can help future generations save money on their energy bills. This can save household running costs. And that I think, capturing that sense of hope and a sense that it's a positive change rather than it's a negative change that's reducing people's freedoms, is a really important political game changer, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I completely agree. So we had the by-elections, and then MPs have gone off on holiday for 6 weeks.
Well, they've gone to their constituencies, haven't they?
I am being...
I'm sure, from many of them, that's a lovely holiday.
There is, of course, always this perception every year that MPs go on holiday for 6 weeks of the year. They basically are in recess for the same time as the school summer holidays. Of course, we all know that's not true, and most MPs, not all of them, will be out working incredibly hard in their constituencies, doing surgeries and visits and all the rest of it. But I always think it's worth putting that myth to bed, the idea that they go off and do nothing for the summer.
Yeah, absolutely. Although, I bet there are a few party leaders who are really quite grateful that they haven't got the constant scrutiny and clamour of Parliament and their groupings within Parliament to deal with over the summer. That must be a nice sense of light relief to just actually be able to get on and do the job, rather than having to worry about the people on the benches behind you, which is often the lot of a leader. Particularly so at the moment on the Conservative side, I think.
Yeah, well, certainly he has. Rishi Sunak has some very restless backbenchers, and we kind of now. So we're going into the summer recess. We kind of now have this long break over the summer of Parliament. We're back for a couple of weeks, and we've got a couple of Purpose Coalition events actually in Parliament when it returns.
It used to be called Silly Season, you know. You're far too young to know this, but Silly Season was from the Queen Mother's birthday to last night of the proms. And it's basically when most of the national press took leave of its senses, and you got all sorts of weird and wonderful stories about, singing acorns or whatever it might happen to be. And
it just happens all year round now, doesn't it?
Well, I think Silly Season has turned into Silly Year, really. And of course, we no longer have a Queen Mother, although we do have last night of the proms. Silly Season. It's that time of year when there's no main political news or less political news, so all sorts of other human interest stories are found and promoted.
We're already starting to see over the summer that rolling in to the conference season, which I think is going to be probably the most important that we've seen of this Parliament. I mean, it will probably be the last set of party conferences before the next general election. There could be one more, but we don't yet know.
Yeah.
So it's going to be very important for Labour. It's going to be very important for Rishi Sunak as his first party conference. What do you think the parties are going to be doing over the summer in order to start preparing for that season?
Well, party conferences, in many ways, they're quite an old-fashioned thing, because in modern political terms, they're really quite risky, because certainly for Labour, the opportunity for people to get up and attack the party and get national coverage for doing that in the party's own conference is really quite great, and there are always complaints that Labour is stage managing it and that it's just a PR fest. Actually, Labour's conference is always the most important event of the calendar, partly because what Labour Party conference does is set the themes for Labour's internal policy discussions for the coming year or the coming 2 years. And that means that this year's conference won't just set the policy agenda for Labour, it'll basically set the outline of the manifesto for Labour. And I think that's going to be really interesting, and we're pretty confident that that's going to be mainly based around the 5 missions that Kier announced back in January. You and I have been working with quite a lot of our members around events at Party Conference. There's definitely a very strong interest in having a presence there this year. And we've got some great organisations with fantastic stories to tell, whether it's about apprenticeships or skills training or getting people into the workplace from disadvantaged backgrounds, or helping their local community by reinvesting some of their profits. There's some great stories there, and many of the Purpose Coalition members, I think, will find themselves in really strong alignment with the values of Labour, and I hope that the work that we can do over the next year or so is about demonstrating to Labour that our members can be part of a potential Labour government's delivery programme too.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, one of the events at conference that I'm most looking forward to is the one that we're doing in association with Baltimore Bank around growth and going for growth, and how banks can help support SMEs. And one of the things I think that's really important in those missions is that growth has been put front and centre. There's been a perception since Liz Truss spent 6 weeks with the economy last year that growth is something that you can't do, that's not important, that we don't focus on. When actually Kier Starmer's put it front and centre and said, yes, we absolutely need to go for growth and boost jobs and productivity. And I think it'll be a really important part of the conference. I think every organisation needs to be thinking that their contribution to the mission and of course the other missions as well.
And certainly in the Labour context, what does growth look like that is responsible and sustainable? Because there is sometimes a backlash from the left of British politics that growth is exploitation of people and planet, and that we should be moving towards a more circular economy, and we should be less obsessed with growth and more obsessed with sustainability. And I'm not saying that those arguments are wrong or misfounded. I think they're quite important ones. But with a growing population and in a global context where international trade is going to be increasingly significant now that we're outside of the EU trading bloc, making sure that we have a clear commitment to growth which also addresses our social challenges, our inequalities, our poverty levels in some parts of the country, I think is absolutely essential. And it feels as though we've allowed over the last decade or so economic growth and social policy to be seen as different things, whereas actually they're the same thing. They're just two sides of the same coin. Creating more and better jobs and building more and better homes is good for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely, and it'll be, I think, a very key part of the Labour Party conference and what organisations are talking about, and all of our events actually going to tie very closely to each of those 5 missions. And I think that's going to be important for organisations to think about when they're talking to Labour, is how do they link in with those policies and those missions. One of the things that we might get before
you though, because I know champagne flows freely at Conservative Party conference, but I don't think
not anymore.
Well, I've ever seen a bottle of champagne at a Labour Party conference unless it was a raffle prize.
What do they drink at the Labour Party conference? Is it Diet Coke and orange juice, or?
Oh, it depends who's watching. If you don't care, Prosecco. If you're trying to be up there and display your proletarian links, probably beer.
Well, I think there'll be a lot more money spent on the Labour Party conference hospitality this year than there might have been in recent years. Back to the back to the prawn cocktail offensive.
Well, it's nice for Labour to have something to celebrate, although I've been in this circumstance myself, actually, when I've been through leadership election campaigns, that all my evidence and data was telling me that I'd won. It was fine. But you just don't believe it until you see the final result. There's almost a superstition around it. And so that's going to be one of the interesting things about the Labour Party conference this year. To what extent does Labour set out a really clear direction of travel now? Got the missions, there might be some other stuff as well. And how much does it risk almost creating its own tacklines by doing so far ahead of a potential general election? And that I think is going to be one of the interesting things to watch. And
we've seen this already with the childcare policy that Bridget Phillipson set up, almost entirely, government said, thanks very much, great idea, we'll take it up ourselves. And that is a big risk for all opposition parties to be putting forward these policies too far in advance, and then discover that the government of the day decides to take them as their own.
I think there's also something really quite important for me, which is a sense that government can actually change things for the better, which is a belief that we've sort of lost to a large extent in this country recently. And that's, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, that's worrying if you believe in democracy, because the idea that actually democracy is not much worth it because it doesn't really improve people's lives is very, very dangerous.
That kind of, they're all the same type attitude.
They're all the same, why should I bother? Yeah, that complacency, I think, opens up fertile ground for the far right and fascism.
And before we get to conference, there's probably one key thing that we should touch on.
The Barbie
Reshuffles. Well, have you been to see it?
I've seen it. You haven't, I don't think, have you? It's great.
I've been to see it.
It's a
fascinating. Really my thing.
Well, I wasn't entirely sure it was going to be my thing either. But it's a terrific critique of modern social structures, as well as being very
interesting.
Funny. Yeah,
is it a very political movie then?
Yeah, it is. It is.
I mean, you can't help but walk and see all of the norms that have been through. I've seen planes with it on, I've seen buses, I've seen Barbie-themed ice cream. That's quite extraordinary, really.
Oh, yeah. Well, and without giving any plot twists away, because I'm sure you're going to see it at some point, it sends Mattel and previous incarnations of Barbie up something rotten. It's very, very, very funny, as well as being quite profound. So yeah, and various of my friends are doing the sort of two films in one go experience, and Oppenheimer and then Barbieheimer or Oppenbarb or whatever it's called.
Watching them back to back, I hear.
Back to back, exactly. Which maybe we should do at some point over the summer, now that we've got a little more time on our hands.
Well, certainly.
So, I jumped straight into Barbie before we got into Reshuffles, although there is a reshuffle.
I mean, it feels like we've been talking about Kier Starmer's reshuffle for at least a year. It feels like there's a question of when will it actually come? Is it going to happen? Is he? I mean, I suppose for any opposition party, you'd probably be asking yourself the question: why would I have a reshuffle when I'm 20 points ahead consistently in the opinion polls? It becomes quite a risky thing to do. I think, especially given Kier Starmer's previous experience of reshuffles, which it's fair to say haven't always been the smoothest, and people have ended up having to take extra jobs and all the rest of it. But
it looks easy from the outside, but it's so difficult on the inside. I mean, even at a council level, when I did reshuffles in Newcastle, it was a bit like playing three-dimensional chess, because you could have a really good idea about where you wanted to get to, but as soon as somebody said, actually, no, I'm not prepared to do that, the whole plan starts to fall apart. And it's even more complex at a government level. And of course, I think what Kier will be wanting to do is, well ahead of the conference season, make sure that he's got the right people in the right shadow portfolios, so people are playing to their strengths, and he'll want to make sure he's got his best communicators on the significant, important issues. Which, to be fair, actually, I think he's more or less got at the moment. Wes, who's obviously launched a health campaign with us, Bridget on education and childcare, Angie on opportunity, and that plays very much to the Purpose Coalition agenda around improving social mobility, and Johnny Reynolds on growth. And I think you can see some really strong performers there, but there are more people I think who are capable of doing more, and so we may well see a bit of tweaking and a bit of changing of the team over the summer, just so that people are playing properly to their strengths.
Who do you think we might see enter Shadow Cabinet for the first time?
For the first time, or again, because that's different?
I suppose either.
Well, I mean, people are talking about Hilary Benn making a comeback, which would be lovely. I mean, Hilary is terrific. He's got a very dry sense of humour, and one of his fashion things is he always wears Doc Marten boots.
I remember meeting her actually at Labour Party conference last year, and what a lovely man he is. He is just...
He's a genuinely lovely man.
He offered to help put a roller banner up with me, which is not the kind of thing you'd normally expect Shadow Secretary to do. But
have the advantage he's very tall, so it's quite handy when it comes to putting banners up.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think there are a few people to watch, not necessarily directly into the Shadow Cabinet, but I think what happens to Alison McGovern would be really interesting. Yeah. I mean, of course, Alison's a friend of ours. She's done a lot of stuff with the Purpose Coalition over the years, and is a terrific advocate for our kind of agenda in Parliament. So it's great to see that she won this election, will be continuing in a new parliamentary seat, and has frankly dealt with some really nasty and hostile politics in our local Labour Party, which I think she deserves a lot of credit and payback for, because she's held her nerve and stayed with the party, and I think she may well find herself in a not necessarily shadow cabinet role, but a serious large shadow ministry role. And then, of course, there's the new generation of the 2019 intake. There's some really great candidates there. Flo Eshalomi, for example.
Very good.
Who is absolutely terrific. Some of the people elected in by-elections. Sam Dixon in Cheshire, Chester, and Andrew Weston, actually, who's making a terrific name for himself in house building.
He certainly is. He's and what I really think Andrew has done an incredible job on it is that Frost Party working. It's something that the public want to see. He did a huge amount of work with Simon Clarke, probably not politically aligned in any way, but on those key issues like house building. And actually, what I think is really interesting about Andrew is coming up with some of those quite interesting new policy ideas. So things like, could you designate all of the land within a mile of a station to be house building, which is one of his proposals. He's to sort of build home of what people need. I think he's been doing a perfect job, and obviously using all of the local government experience, like be able to forward some of those policy ideas.
And I think we'll see. We've already seen a good number of people with significant local government experience be selected in parliamentary seats for Labour. I think we'll see more of that, and that means that although the PLP might currently lack government experience, the benches are being significantly strengthened with people with local government experience, and that sort of pragmatic, problem-solving approach, where delivery is more important than straightforward party politics, I think is really welcome within Labour.
Do we think that Kier will use the reshuffle as an opportunity to align those shadow portfolio, the shadow portfolios and the roles there to those new government departments that were formed by Rishi Sunak? We've obviously seen reports that Lucy Powell is keen on taking the shadow science job. But do you think he'll use it as an opportunity to do that?
Um, I honestly don't know. I think Kier will probably want to keep climate change and energy as a really strong focus. I don't think that'll be wrapped up into a sort of a business and industry ministry. I think he'll want to keep that focus. I think I don't think we'll see a return of international development as a separate department. All sorts of issues and challenges about it going in with the Foreign Office, but I think that reading the runes, although that's not terribly popular within the international development sector, I think it's been done. So why unpick it? Is probably the view within Labour at the moment.
We all know as well, reorganisations are very different. There's one thing renaming a department. I was chatting to somebody from the Science Technology Department, and they were saying that they only just got their office. This was about a month ago, and they'd only just got their office. I mean, this department was established in February. That's an awful long time to put civil servants, on hold, on pause, whilst they work new structures and all the rest of it.
Mm. And of course, anything like that, any restructure of government, there's a hiatus period where everybody sort of looks internally at what's where they're going to end up, and as a result, it loses focus on delivery. It's one of the big mistakes that George Osborne made when he became Chancellor back in 2010, because he announced that he was going to review all of Labour's infrastructure projects and funding. And what that did was, for about 18 months, put on hold a lot of major schemes that meant that had a huge ripple effect all the way down the system. And so people were laid off, critical skills were lost, momentum was lost in terms of particular schemes, and it took another 3 or 4 years to get back up to previous delivery levels. So one of the things that Labour will have to think really carefully about ahead of the election, and particularly in terms of what the government structures might look like the other side of the election, is yes, reform government to make it work better, but do it in a way that is going to be least disruptive to delivery, because the crucial time to establish credibility to deliver is in the first few months, first year or so, really, of an incoming government. And if you don't do it then, you really lose the opportunity. And that's why I think, although there's a recognition that major reform of the civil service is needed, there's a bit of a question about how to do it and when to do it in terms of the parliamentary cycle.
We've got a lot to look forward to then. Conference, if we get over the summer, reshuffles. It's going to be a busy couple of months, and certainly we have a huge number of Purpose Coalition events in the next couple of months.
We do, and don't forget, you've got to watch the Barbie movie. That's worth looking forward to as well.
I will take your advice.
From the autumn onwards, we're ramping up the Purpose Coalition work, particularly in terms of Purpose for Labour, and we'll be organising a series of roundtables around the missions and associated policy themes. Because there's just so much really interesting stuff happening in our members at the moment, some really exciting stuff that is worth sharing on a bigger platform, and we'll be working out how to do that at conference and in the months beyond as well.
Well, I'm very much looking forward to it. Hopefully get a break over the summer and then straight back into it.
Yeah. Any plans to go anywhere nice?
Well, I'm off to Italy in a couple of weeks' time, which will be very nice.
Very nice, but very hot.
Yeah, in particular, going for a point on policy. And then somewhere else in the UK at the end of the month, but I'm not entirely sure where yet. No, look forward to it. What about you, Nick?
Well, do you know, normally we'll be heading up to Scotland this time of year, but we've got a big holiday planned in the autumn, going to Canada. So this August it's going to be mainly day trips out. But that's great, because in Newcastle in the northeast, there's so many amazing places to do day trips to, whether it's Lindisfarne or the Durham Dales or Barnard Castle. I might go and get my eyes tested. Yeah, great summer to look forward to.
Well, have a great time, and we will doing the podcast very soon.
Well, good to talk to you, and have a good summer. And the Forbes and McPherson show will be back online in September.
Thanks, Ned.
Take care.